we need to get started on our next panel, which I'm delighted to be able to welcome here to Michigan and to this conference. This panel is called Revitalization Through Advocacy. So whereas previous panels have been more concerned with, one might say, or at least if you look at the panel titles, it seems as if we had endangerment for 3 panels, and now we have revitalization. Resilience, I suppose, is for the reception. So we have 2 speakers who represent revitalization through advocacy in different ways. Our first one will be Dan Kaufman, who teaches at Queens College, which is part of the City University of New York system, but also runs an outfit that he organized called Endangered Language Alliance. And our other speaker is Justin Brown, who's finishing a PhD in linguistics at the University of Cape Town. And so these are going to be based in very different parts of the world, and I think this panel gives us a chance to think about what kinds of issues we're discussing here are global issues, are similar in different places, and which ones are ones where you need to think about the local situation much more precisely. So, to start off, Dan Kaufman, oh, there you are, who's going to speak on Indigenous languages in New York City, ideology and conservation.
Thank you, thanks. How does this work now? Oh. All right. So, thank you for inviting me. It's been a wonderful conference so far. All the talks have been very well organized and well polished, and I'm going to put an end to that right now. I'm going to talk about New York City, so that's not the first place you think about when you think about indigenous languages, but I'll argue that it's an important place, and I think that all cities are becoming increasingly important in the kinds of issues that we've been discussing today, language maintenance, language revitalization, and indigenous issues more generally. So let's look. So the kind of questions, oh, this is going to be a challenge. The kind of questions I'm interested in are, who are the indigenous people living in New York City and other large cities in the US? I'm going to talk about 2 groups, or 2 regions rather. To what extent do indigenous people in New York have shared experiences? I'm going to compare people from 2 regions a little bit. Okay, much better. And yes. And is there hope for maintaining indigenous languages in urban diaspora contexts, as I think these kinds of contexts are becoming more and more important? So I'm going to look at 2 regions, like I said, the Himalayas and Mexico and Central America. And the data I'm going to be talking about comes from interviews that we've done over the last couple of years, but especially the interviews with the indigenous Mexicans and Central Americans is quite recent. It's from a project that I'll talk about a little later, and a collaboration with the New York City Department of Health. And I'm quite excited with that project and its results, and so I'm going to present it in a kind of raw form. But it's fresh. So yeah, I'm interested also in the relationship between a community's language ideology, if we can talk about a shared language ideology across a community, and the rate of language transmission or other kinds of aspects of language transmission. To what extent does a community's belief about language influence whether it gets passed down to the next generation, right? That's basically what language ideology is. It's just, what does a person or a community think about language? When is a particular language appropriate in a particular place? What is the value of language, right? Those kinds of questions. And to what extent is language transmission determined by historical and socioeconomic factors in diaspora communities? That is, factors that are really outside of their control. So the first project I'll talk about is the Voices of the Himalayas. And it was a documentary or language documentation project based in New York City. It consisted of 25 videos, which ended up being more or less 5 hours of edited footage. And some of the people involved are shown in this picture. Nawang Gurung, who's striking the cool pose, is a kind of a local, he's kind of the mayor of the Tibetan community in a way in New York City. An anthropologist, Sienna Craig from Dartmouth College, who works in Nepal, myself and my co-director at Ella, Ross Perlin, and Mark Turin of the University of British Columbia, as well as a student of mine, Tenzin Namdol, Sarah Freedy, who's a videographer, and many, many speakers and volunteers contributed. We talk a bit about this project in an upcoming article called Orality and Mobility, and so I'll just kind of go over some of the basic facts of the community. So in New York, we have very diverse Himalayan groups in contact. We have intense multilingualism, as might be expected. When we look at language diversity in New York City, actually, we find that most of it comes from this region as well as the Mexican region, and these two regions are two of the most multilingual in the world, actually. Tibetan itself is actually treated as a homogeneous language, typically by outsiders, but what's referred to as dialects, things like Amdo, Kam, and Mustang, are really independent languages, and some of them are quite endangered. The majority of Tibetic languages have under 10,000 speakers, but there's really no clear figures on most of them. Assimilating to national languages in the diaspora is something that's been happening with these various Tibetic languages. They've mostly been converging on Standard Tibetan as kind of this core marker of identity because the Tibetan community, the Tibetan Buddhist community is quite an organized community, as I'll show. You have Standard Tibetan, which is supported by a range of institutions in New York, things like Sunday language schools, various Sunday schools, as well as these ethnic community groups that meet on the weekends. And even though you have Sherpa and Mustangi and Bhutanese organizations, often these smaller ethnic groups actually promote Standard Tibetan. So in the Himalayan region, India, Nepal, and Bhutan, we see have something like 2.5 of the world's land, but they host 11.5 of the world's endangered languages. So not only is it an intense area of multilingualism and linguistic diversity, it also contains many of the world's endangered languages. The fall of the Nepali monarchy in 1990 ultimately led to the recognition of local languages as official languages, but there were a few changes on the ground. This should already be familiar to anybody who's listening to the previous talks. In many cases, we see dramatic changes on paper that don't lead to any real changes on the ground. So local languages are still predominantly restricted to the family domain, and in fact, they're referred to as home languages in Nepal, right? And often, in interviews or in casual speaking to people, it's quite difficult to find out what a person's home language is. You really have to dig a little bit until they tell you what the home language is. So it's oftentimes not really considered a language, right? The language is the official language, right? So this is actually similar to the second region I'll talk about, Mexico. You have a process of out-migration and sedentarization and sinification within China, and all of these are leading to linguistic and cultural loss. In New York City, we don't have a very clear idea of how many speakers there are. 20,000 is one number that's kind of flung around. The census, of course, messes this up because many Tibetans are counted as Chinese nationals in the census, and those from Nepal are counted as Nepalis. And so there's this undercount, which is quite typical of the census. And now, of course, there's an intentional undercount that's being argued in the courts, right? The upcoming census, this administration wants to put a question about citizenship in the upcoming census, which is really only being done to drain places like New York of resources because it'll scare undocumented people. So there's an undercount, and the next census, if that goes through, there'll be an even more radical undercount. This is a map I helped make of the languages of Queens, which is probably the most linguistically diverse place in the world, counting immigrant languages, of course. And we can kind of zoom in on the neighborhood of interest here. which is Jackson Heights. And so in orange, you can see the national languages and languages that are represented in libraries and other things in Queens. And in the gray letters, you can see the unofficial languages and non-national languages. And you can see a general pattern. If you recognize some of the languages, you'll see that the unofficial languages are clustered within national communities, right? This is not to say that each language has its own physical community. It doesn't. But it's embedded in larger national communities. So within a Mexican community, you'll find indigenous Mexican languages. Within a South Asian community, you'll find indigenous Nepali languages, etc. This is one snapshot that I think is probably the best illustration of the intense kind of linguistic diversity we find in Queens, Himalayan linguistic diversity. This is a single storefront on 75th Street in Jackson Heights, okay? And if you look carefully at what's going on here, and there's a lot, you'll find a Tibetan sign. Okay, that's not surprising. There's a lot of Tibetan signage in this neighborhood. You'll find movie posters and other kind of ads, often in Hindi or Nepali. Not so surprising. You'll find religious organizations, Tibetan Buddhist organizations, in this case the Karmapa Service Society, dedicated to a particular religious figure in Tibetan Buddhism. But more interesting for our purposes is you'll find these kidugs, which are the regional organizations. So the Mustang Kidug USA. Right? Mustang is a very small area. I'll show you where it is on the map later. It's host to a very unique Tibetic language, which is endangered. And yet they have a community here in New York, and they support their culture and their language, even though this is a relatively, very small community in New York. They're organized, okay? And here's the Gyal Sumdo Sewa Sansta Incorporated USA, another type of organization. And if you actually look this up, Gyal Sumdo, you'll find that this is an endangered language and that it was almost unknown to linguistics until relatively recently. In 2011, Christine Hildebrand and Joseph Perry had a paper, Preliminary Notes on Gyal Sumdo, an undocumented Tibetan variety in Manang district, Nepal. And here they are in Queens with their own organization and everything. And another one, the Kiranti Association, another group of languages, most of which are endangered, spoken in Nepal, very different from Tibetan, but related, and they have their own organization. And this is just one building, right? So you can imagine the intense kind of diversity that the entire neighborhood has. So as part of this interview, set of interviews we did with different speakers of Tibetic languages, we discovered a lot of things. Among them was some unexpected things like language ideology that came out, but also language attitudes. The idea of this was that everything was going to be public, right? So we put all of this on YouTube, and a lot of the information, a lot of the more interesting things that we found was from the comments and the reactions from other communities. So we can play some of these, maybe. Can we play that? Yeah.
I think it's particularly the relationships and the networks that I had access to, the privilege of having access to, that led me to college in the first place. Tandanga Hampshire College la jure, ani Amherst, Massachusetts la yore, ani tandanga junior year, ani public policy on women's reproductive health changi. Tangbungi lo tangbo first year freshman year langi karsa intro to feminist theory class lemba ani ondi class tinga nge karsa interest academic interest pe shape chisung nganzu theory desu changdu hala practice ki samno tang.
So we were interested in what's happening, you know, how is the language actually being used and transmitted in New York, right? So you might notice, even if you don't speak Tibetan, that there's a lot of English words there, right? One thing that jumped out at us immediately was in the reactions to this video, which we thought would have been positive, as this is a young Tibetan trying to, you know, speak fluent Tibetan, who's kind of made it educationally. we found that there were actually quite negative comments towards this, that there was actually a kind of Tibetan language police, right, that was very negative about code switching, right, going back and forth from English to Tibetan. And it was also negative about, well, probably their negativity was influenced also by the content of the interview. She's not talking about traditional things. She's talking about Western education, feminist theory, patriarchy later in the video. And so in the comments, it turned out that these kinds of, the combination, well, her language use itself was provoking very negative reactions, surprisingly. Okay, we can look at another one. Yeah, we can skip this. And of course, we had to end up defending her publicly. We had to say that this is, you know, code switching is natural and it shouldn't be critiqued, and all of that. Another discovery was that there were endangered languages that were actually being learned in New York. And this was kind of a bit of a shock to us. So the Mustang, which I mentioned a minute ago, is a kind of remote but important, historically very important area in the Tibetan region, in Nepal though. And it turned out that people, the language is undergoing attrition. People are shifting to Standard Tibetan and to Nepali. But people would be coming to New York and immersing themselves in this small, tight-knit community and actually learning Mustang, right? So we can play this maybe just a little bit.
Ani the duro ori mimi ji ma de ya de party jore dona karudona ani karudona ori mi de mi ji dido ro chela kauchi gi mila ani mi ji friend na gole de do ya ani o chela dang allo ge kya she ani ori mimi ji ma do sore ori mi pura la lo ge kya garan koshish mi ji chele ya ani le lo ro cha da na o si apo shinge ori ge.
Yeah. So this was an interesting phenomena that we thought could be possible, but we didn't know if it was really happening. And it turned out that in certain cases, it really was happening, that endangered languages were being learned in the diaspora. 10 minutes. All right, let me skip that. So to sum up the features of the Himalayan communities, in particular the Tibetan and Tibetic communities, I would call them reconstituted communities in the sense that they've carved out a geographical space in New York City. They've established formal village and ethnic organizations. They've maintained social networks across families. They celebrate festivals collectively. They contribute to welfare projects back in the homeland. So they've really reconstituted what could really be called a community in a traditional sense. Just to show you the extent of how reconstituted it is, this is Nepal, and this is a kind of map of this area superimposed on it. This is the area where Mustang, Upper Mustang is spoken, right? So there's two major dialects, Mustang, Upper Mustang, and Lower Mustang. This is Upper Mustang, and the Upper Mustang community moved to the Jackson Heights area. This is the Lower Mustang community, and they moved to Brooklyn. But shockingly, there's another language within this area, which is called Seke, which is quite different. And they're kind of embedded in this Lower Mustang community, and here they are embedded within the Lower Mustang community in Brooklyn. So this is not typical, but this is an amazing illustration of how communities can be transplanted, linguistic communities. I'm going to skip a little bit, or a lot. I'll just skip to this. So I want to look at the actual text, some of the quotes from this material. This is an interesting one. So our Tibetan language, if we really think about it, is important not just for us, but important globally for the welfare of all sentient beings. The reason is that the teachings of Buddha and his philosophy are based on nonviolence and the prevailing of peace and compassion in the world. We don't know exactly how Buddhist philosophy was spread and existed in India in the ancient period. So currently much of Buddhist philosophy relies on Tibetan translation. So in this individual's language ideology, Tibetan is actually goes beyond the Tibetan community, and it's of crucial spiritual value to the world, right? And there's a crucial spiritual component there. Right? Other speakers make the same comment, that the language cannot vanish, because with the language vanishing, the religion would vanish. And these two things are crucially linked, right? And each one preserves the other. Okay? So to sum up these kinds of Tibetic language ideologies in diaspora, the Tibetan language is seen as kind of inseparable from Buddhism. Tibetan language is a gift to the world, not only Tibetans. Tibetan linguistic diversity reflects the diverse history of the region, right? Mind you, though, this is really Tibetan that we're talking about. The languages I referred to before, for instance, some of those signs on the storefront in Jackson Heights, those are not Tibetan languages, really, and the people who speak them are not Buddhists, right? So this has a kind of limited scope, right, over certain Tibetan Buddhists. It doesn't hold for the entirety of the Himalayan community. But then these positive ideological elements are confronted with difficult socioeconomic realities in New York and uneven relations between these different varieties. So many Tibetic speaking mothers work as nannies, and they have less time with their own children. Tibetan Sunday schools and other institutions are strong, but they really support a standardized kind of language. And for many, these people have already come from another diasporic city, namely Dharamsala in India, right? So this is a kind of second diaspora for many of these people. All right, let me quickly go through my other community, my other region here. And as the indigenous languages of Latin America, this photo is from a kind of literacy workshop that we did, an indigenous language literacy workshop that we did, that tried to introduce writing in Mixteco and English at the same time to a small group of mothers in East Harlem. So the indigenous languages of Mexico are shown roughly on this map, and each color is more or less a different language. As you can see, all of the language, or the real diversity, is clustering in certain areas, namely the states of Oaxaca and Guerrero. And as it turns out, this area, Guerrero, is really the prime sending region to New York City, right? So the area that is most linguistically diverse is sending a large portion of its population to New York City. As a result, many of those languages are now spoken in New York. I think I'll skip this because in an earlier presentation we actually heard a bit about the history of Mexican language policy. In short, it's not very pretty. Things have turned around recently, but for many languages it's kind of too little, too late. What's interesting in this case is that New York, because of this pattern of migration, has a larger percentage of indigenous languages than Mexico itself. So in Mexico, it's something like 6% of Mexicans who speak an indigenous language. In New York City, it seems to be at least 17%, right? So almost triple. Right? So this project that I just mentioned briefly earlier is from a study funded by the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene as part of a collaborative project. It's with many people, but two of the most important, Crystal Reyes and Telma Carrillo. And it consists of 30 interviews, more or less an hour long or more each, with members of 6 indigenous ethnic groups, the kind of larger indigenous ethnic groups in New York City from Latin America: Nahuatl speakers, Mixteco speakers, Quiche, Mam, 2 Mayan languages from Guatemala, Garifuna from the Atlantic coast, Honduras and Guatemala, and Quechua from Ecuador. And the interview sought to understand language use at home, language transmission, issues of access, discrimination, and health issues. So a giant rainbow of issues, right? And I'm just going to, and we're really just starting to look at it now, and I wanted to present some of the data in a more raw form so you could see it, but I don't want to try and editorialize or even curate it much. It's quite exciting to me because it's the first time we have anything like this from New York City. Nobody has done any kind of research on indigenous Latin Americans in New York City in a systematic way. Nobody knows about language transmission in New York City, so for me, this is quite exciting. As opposed to these kinds of reconstituted communities we saw in the Himalayas, these communities are much more atomized, I call them. They're embedded in these larger national communities, but there's no clustering, right? So Nahuatl speakers are kind of everywhere, that there are Spanish speakers in New York, there's Nahuatl speakers embedded here and there. There's no formal organizations, and this is different from earlier Mexican migrations to New York City. In the more recent migrations that contain the most indigenous languages, there's really no organization whatsoever. Social networks are really the family. That's the unit. That's the only real unit is the extended family. Collective festivals are just national festivals. Money is sent back home on a purely individual basis, a family basis. So extremely different from the Himalayan case. So I just wanted to run through some of these things, some of these ideas and feelings that our interviewees expressed to us regarding their own languages, discrimination and things like that. So we heard about discrimination within the family. That came up several times. In response to a question about it, one speaker of Mam said, yes, when I arrived, I said it'll be good if I speak my language. This brother-in-law of mine, because I spoke to my child in Mam, he said, you're not in Guatemala, here you are in New York. I felt bad when I heard other people speaking in Mam. I said, I don't have to be ashamed of that. I spoke Mam from when I was born. And this turns out to be a very common trope in the interviews, that a lot of the discrimination comes from within the family itself and within the community. I think, in fact, a video that we had recorded prior to this project explains this problem better. Maybe we could play this just for a minute. This video, I think, touches on several relevant points. It was recorded with a Mixteco mother from Staten Island, in New York. Oh, should have been it should have been from a particular point. The point which, skip it, it's all right.
We hear Mixteco,
That's okay. So basically she says that her husband was angry at her when she was speaking Mixteco to her son, and the teacher from the school was there, and she says back to him, well, you think you're so clever. When you speak Spanish, everybody knows it's not your first language. You're always mispronouncing things. You're always missing some words. And so there was this ongoing tension within the house, which we find is typical. Overall, the recurring theme, when we asked, what is the importance of the language to you? What's the value of the language? Again and again, in these communities, we hear that the children will go back and they will not be able to communicate with my parents. Right? That was the number one factor here. Right? It's a very practical language ideology. Right? It's a very practical reason for passing on your language, because their parents, in almost all the cases, are monolingual. Right, which is an interesting fact. In fact, many of the migrants themselves who come to New York are monolingual when they arrive in New York, which originally I was shocked by, and now I realize that that was much more normal than I realized, that people were learning Spanish in New York City. Right. So this comes up again and again, that when the children go back, inevitably, they think, to Guatemala or to Mexico, that they will have to speak in the community to their parents, and they won't be able to use Spanish or English. Let me just skip. Another point I wanted to make here was that there was a great disconnect between the reality of language transmission and the perceived language transmission. So people would say, for instance, when we asked them about the future, they would admit that, yes, we're losing our languages, we're moving away from our country, from our languages, our culture, we forget about that, now we're into other things, only using Spanish. Well, do you think the next generation of Cabricanecos, this is a Mam area in Guatemala, in New York, will speak Mam with their children? Oh yeah, Mam is strong, I think so. Right? And so this also recurred again and again with the different interviewees, that they would notice that there's a total, really almost a total break in transmission, but they were very sure that the children would eventually pick up the language later in life. Yeah, all right, I'll maybe stop with this one. So a classic question in kind of Fishmanian sociolinguistics is, do you have to speak X to be X, okay? And that was a question that we asked also. So can a person be Mam without speaking the language? And one person said, no, when a Mam no longer speaks her language, she's no longer Mam. She's like a Spanish person because they never understand Mam. If they don't understand Mam, they're not Mam. For me, my children are not mom because they don't understand a word in mom. I have to teach them to come singing words. I'm not quite sure what was meant by that. They arrive there and they'll get used to it because they know mom there. They're listening to words in mom and then they'll become mom again. Right? So a very different and interesting way of connecting language and ethnicity. So their children, these are fully, mom family, and saying that their children are not mom because they don't understand it, but they can become mom again. Okay. I will skip. I was very delusional how much I thought I could say in 20 minutes. I'll sum up. Well, one more. I can't resist. I love this stuff. Discrimination, right? This is from Quechua speakers from Ecuador. When I was still young and lived in Ecuador, we had difficulties, especially with mestizos. They made fun of us for speaking Quechua. We had a complex that even when they asked us what language we speak, we said the language that has no value, Yangashimi. This is how we knew it in Imbabura or in my community. That's how we've been ashamed and have despised our language. Right? And again, that was an extremely common sentiment between the both communities, not only the Latin American communities, but the Himalayan ones as well. All right, let me go to the conclusion. So in conclusion, what kind of differences do we see here? The number one factor in wanting to pass down the language was communication with grandparents. There were some broader ideas as well, cultural motivations among certain groups. In strong contrast to all of the other groups, the Garifuna, who I didn't have time to talk about, we find a real spiritual connection, because the Garifuna have a kind of ancestral religion, and the language there is critical for speaking to the ancestors. And this is something that's unique among these groups. The Garifuna are very different. There was a gulf between the competence that the parents describe for the children and the apparent real competence, and a gulf of like the views of the future versus the linguistic reality. So yeah, to sum up, this kind of practical language ideology we see with the indigenous Latin American communities is quite fragile, right? Because what happens when the grandparental generation is no longer monolingual, right? That will happen quite soon, right? 20 years, 30 years maximum. So in both communities, the greatest culprit actually seems to be the lack of time between parents and children, right? Not necessarily anything else except the lack of parents and time. New York is especially acute in the really cruel and illegal number of hours that many of the families have to work, right? As a result, the children are being raised basically by iPhones and iPads. So it's a problem that technology can't solve in this case, I think. I think this is something that requires other interventions. I'll end it there. Sorry for going over. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Justin Brown, who's going to speak about language prophets and language profits.
Hi, good afternoon. Kaites, good day. I'm going to be talking about Kwekwe language, and that version of good day is what Bruce Mannheim would call an overlap. Is it overlay? I'm sorry. The more appropriate greeting is Kaitsko, which would translate literally as, "Are you awake?" So I think that's quite apt for the last presentation. It's a great honor for me to be here. And so thank you to Cindy, to Howard, and to Andres Kutsiev, and to everyone involved in the workshop. Now, in this paper, I want to explore the interface between being a language activist on the one hand and being what some have called a cultural entrepreneur on the other. I want to focus on the term resilience and the different ways not only languages, but people may may be said to be resilient. By doing this, I hope to shed some light on what it means to be indigenous in South Africa today. Specifically, I examine how two Kwekwe language activists are striving in slightly different ways to be indigenous. The paper looks at the paths of two Cape Town activists, Bradley and Denver, and specifically at how they practice their activism, what their visions of being authentically Kwe is, and how they are managing to make a living through their activism while remaining true to their activist values. I want to examine the activities of Bradley and Denver through the lens of language and economics, or the economics of language revival, and to look at the economic benefits of Khoisan activism across the board, and also to situate what Bradley and Denver are doing in comparison to approaches taken by some other Khoisan activists who concentrate on things like the fight for land, resources, and political recognition. Okay. Oh, sorry, that Abate Kwekwe is, Abate means carry me. In Afrikaans, Abba is to piggyback someone, so that's quite interesting. So that's the name of the language revival program. Now, just to give you some background, what is that? Khoisan activism did not suddenly emerge around 2010 or in the 1990s when the first meetings and conferences took place. It has roots which run deep in the history of South African identity politics. The main actors in Cape Town's Khoisan resurgence are South Africans who were classified as colored during colonialism and apartheid. I myself was so classified at the time of my birth. These people are Afrikaans and English-speaking, and they're the descendants of European settlers, the diverse slave population, and importantly, the indigenous Kwekwe people who inhabited the area today known as Cape Town in pre-colonial times. Now, the very category of colored is intimately tied to the separatist legacy of colonial thinking, which divided the population into Europeans, natives, so ancestrally indigenous, and then this weird third category of non-native, mixed, or Creole people. Thus, in the 1950, the Apartheid Population Registration Act, a colored person is defined as a negative. So colored identity is defined as a negative, and the act states that being colored includes everyone who in appearance is obviously not white or Indian, and who is not a member of an Aboriginal race or African tribe. However, the oppressive colonial systems of classification notwithstanding, scholars like Muhammad Adikari, 2004, 2009, Dimitri Erasmus in 2001 and 2011, have written about the many creative ways in which colored identities were made and remade and continue to be remade, foregrounding different aspects of a complex and multiple heritage at different times. Core to Khoisan activism is the rejection of this colonial or apartheid label, colored. And so that slogan you see there on the placard, Khoisan forever, colored never, is a well-known slogan commonly seen on placards at protests. The use of inverted commas or gestural air quotes in speech reflects a practice which became popular in the 1980s, indexing the way in which writers and speakers distance themselves from the colonial apartheid label. It should be noted that while many Khoisan activists articulate a broadly pan-Africanist position, reflecting discourses of African nationalism and especially the Black consciousness philosophy of the 1970s, there is also currently widespread disaffection in many so-called colored communities, and this stems from a perceived lack of, well, not perceived, it's actually a real lack of economic opportunity, high levels of unemployment, and social ills such as gangsterism, crime, and drug abuse. And this disaffection has fed into Khoisan activism as well. Now, it is against this backdrop that the modern Khoisan restoration emerged. And I just need to point out that, as I alluded to earlier, the people involved in this movement speak mainly Afrikaans. Afrikaans acts as a kind of lingua franca for the activists. In the picture, the words "I am a Khoisan" is actually written in Afrikaans and not in any Khoi language. Indeed, activists' attitudes about Afrikaans and about the Khoi language influences on Afrikaans are an important focus of my study, though not a focus of this particular talk. But just to be clear, reclaiming and reframing Afrikaans as a Khoi variety or a language of the indigenous Khoi people is a major focus of the restoration movement, and we can talk about that later, if you like. So, now on what basis can a single group in South Africa or one of its neighboring states claim to be indigenous when in fact all black people who live in sub-Saharan Africa are or see themselves as indigenous? The explanation for this is complex, and I believe that the expression of an indigenous identity by Khoisan activists in South Africa is an example of heteroglossia. So it's a marginalized group's multiple, often contested voices struggling to be heard. Interestingly, in the context of modern or post-apartheid South Africa, activists show little inclination to learn isiXhosa or any other indigenous South African language. At best, they are keen to point out that the cliques in isiXhosa came from the Khoi language, but this is done largely to illustrate the historical and continued marginalization of Khoi language and its influence in South Africa. So they basically recount that story as evidence of continued oppression of the language. Now, indigeneity, I think, is always a multi-layered notion which is tied to issues of memory and to historical narratives. The dispossession of the Khoi and the San, their persecution, and the notion that they were the first inhabitants of what would become South Africa, this is what drives Khoisan activism today. There is a sense that to be indigenous in South Africa, to be Khoi, is to have a claim to national belonging that is older, deeper, and more legitimate than any other group. Indigenous activism, or Khoisan activism, has been born out of a strong sense of marginalization, cultural and linguistic, but also political and economic. So through the Khoisan movement, Williams and Stroud 2015 argue that speakers express agency, voice, and participation in an everyday politics of language. But identity politics will always raise the specter of what Gall and Willard call the authority of authenticity, meaning, I think, the idea that people need to make themselves fit neatly into whatever category they happen to be affirming. In this paper, I want to ask how economics and or economic subsistence is tied to being Khoi in South Africa today. So I agree with Katarina Schramm, who writes about the Khoisan restoration, and she says, contemporary indigeneity is closely entangled with questions of wider recognition, restitution, and rights. In these processes, the term indigenous does not signify a stable point of reference or remnant of the past, but a subject position that is actively claimed and enacted in the present. Schramm places the current Khoisan resurgence firmly within international trends of First Nation and indigenous activism. So, interestingly, the term Khoisan has shifted from its beginnings nearly a century ago, when it was used by academics as an etic portmanteau term to index a particular physical type, and it is used by the activists today and by myself as indexing an indigenous or First Nation identity which predates colonial European settlement. But the situation is, of course, very complex, and as late as last week, I was discussing with colleagues how the term Khoisan is deeply problematic, not only for academics, but increasingly for the activists themselves, as they become more and more conscientized. Right, here we all are. So, out of all of these historical and current realities of poverty, civil unrest, and lack of economic opportunity come two queer language activists, Bradley and Denver. And for the rest of the paper, I will explore some of the activities they are involved in and how some of these are tied to economic subsistence. Much of my PhD research has focused on the personal and symbolic significance of queer language revival efforts, and I argue that the material or economic benefits for the language activists are in fact minimal. And yet I've also been struck by how much of the literature on language revivalism carries economic undertones and uses economic metaphors. So things like resources, linguistic capital, language, learning as an investment, etc. Now, I wish to identify three approaches to language and economics, and as it bears on the subject of revitalization. One, what I call, well, not me, a paper by this title is called Dying to be Counted, and this refers to the commodification of endangered languages, mainly within the discipline of linguistics, through things like language documentation. It deals with commodification from a very academic perspective, but also from an NGO, big agency perspective, so raising money from international donors like the UN. It doesn't really touch on small-scale grassroots activism of the type I've been following. So I get this from a paper written by Lisa Dobrin and people at SOAS in London. But another example would be Alexander Duchesne's book on the construction of linguistic minorities at the United Nations. So another approach would be the commodification of language as it appears in the works of scholars like Monica Heller, which focuses on the commodification of language and issues of economic advantage or disadvantage based on language, but looking at very classic economic scenarios or employment scenarios, so call centers, translation, teaching, marketing, tourism, etc. But there is, I think, a third way, an approach that looks at the complex ways activists engage with their ancestral languages, including the ways people may be using the language as a way to generate income. Importantly, this approach looks at people who don't quite fit into the first two. These are people who are not involved in marketing or large-scale tourism projects a la Monica Heller, but neither are they dying to be counted in the sense that they're submitting grants and receiving large amounts of donor money. Now, it's on this third way of people eking out a living, if you like, and doing so using bits and pieces of an ancestral language that they don't actually speak that I want to talk about. But before I do so, I just want to spend a moment describing some of the other economic activities which the two activists I'm going to focus on, and many other people, are critical of. Now, in the last 5 to 10 years, there's been an increase in economic activities which use or draw on the Khoisan restoration movement in a very superficial way, and which really cannot be said to be part of the movement itself, in my view. Now, it's not always clear who is behind these activities and who's benefiting from them, but the general consensus among the people I speak to, so people involved in my study, is that it is often people who are not interested in genuine restoration. It is people who are not involved in the restoration movement itself, or it's people whose status as queer or san is highly questionable. so read white people. The following images were all taken from an internet search I did a couple of years ago. And so you've got the Khoisan Trading Company. I think they make salt. You have Khoisan Tours and Safaris, which is a very, colonial notion, not particularly indigenous to Southern Africa. And yeah, this is a kind of stopover on popular route in the Southern Cape, and it's a kind of restored village, which I'll talk about more later. Now, Kwekwe language activist Bradley and Denver grew up in the same neighborhood in Cape Town, a part of the city far removed from the center, both in geographical and economic terms. They are, in many ways, economically precarious in the sense that they both live with extended family. Neither of them has fixed employment. Both are using Kwekwe Govab, or Kwekwe language, as a way to supplement their incomes, while at the same time promoting the language and the revival movement as a whole. They are therefore what I have termed language prophets, people whose activism centers on spreading the word, acting as de facto spokespeople for the broader revival movement, and recruiting people to the movement. But they also represent a particular vision of what it means to be queer. They're spiritual, they're selfless, they're committed, and above all, they're community-oriented. They set themselves apart from those who are individualistic, opportunistic, and concerned only with titles and positions. Bradley's philosophical approach to the restoration movement can be summed up in the following quote. So Bradley says, now, just the means of establishing forms of recognition, that was one area that we found that we had a different position. We actually took our key from what we saw in first language-speaking queer communities, in Namibia, for example. We saw that the culture, the language, is very dominant in terms of the cultural expression. So instead of putting forward a title, we are putting forward the culture. And then with that, once you put forward the culture through the language, people automatically will accept your title and not question you. Put it this way. Imagine the Queen of England can't speak English, or the Zulu king can't speak Zulu. It's the same as a queer chief who cannot speak a queer language. So here, Bradley is talking about the ethos which underpins his whole approach to the revival effort. And so it's not about titles. In fact, as he points out quite powerfully, a title is really meaningless, even ludicrous, if the person cannot speak the language. So he's very skeptical of chiefs, self-proclaimed or otherwise, who cannot speak the language. But Bradley is always very respectful, and he's known as a peacemaker, a bridge builder, and someone who works with everyone. Now, the situation is, of course, very complex, and the restoration of Kwekwe customary and or political structures, including new chiefs, is part of the revival movement, though this remains very controversial. Many activists are not interested in chiefs or kings or any other kind of title. Their focus is on the restoration of an identity, a sense of self, a sense of pride in one's past and one's present. This then is a different kind of commodification of language, one which uses the language as a rallying point for indigenous identity, as an index of that identity, in short, as proof that the indigenous queer and San people of South Africa still exist, and so do their languages and their cultures. So, no one in South Africa gets much money from the state to promote queer language, or any other language for that matter. But there are people, as I alluded to earlier, both queer and non-queer, who are attempting to somehow cash in on this restoration movement. Now, can these opportunistic types be set against the work of Bradley and Denver, where's the line? Is there a line? Surely those people are just cultural entrepreneurs, just like Bradley and Denver. Is there a difference between being a cultural entrepreneur and being a linguistic activist or language activist? Can you be both? The difference, I think, may lie in the spiritual and or affective dimension which people like Bradley and Denver always emphasize. This is certainly in sharp contrast to the people who are only after money, titles, and status. But it would be wrong to claim that the activism of Denver and Bradley is completely above material and economic matters. Money, after all, is an ever-present factor, as we all know. So in the remaining moments, I want to briefly consider the economics of being a queer language activist today. What exactly are they doing? Well, in Bradley's case, a lot of it is performance, public speaking. So he gets invited to speak about queer language, queer culture, the restoration effort in general. For instance, he goes to schools, he speaks to children. He's usually invited by people he knows or by people either involved in or sympathetic to the restoration movement. But the point is he would receive some kind of compensation for his appearance. In fact, the very first time I saw Bradley was about 7 or 8 years ago at an event at the University of Cape Town Center for African Studies, where he gave a presentation. It's important to contextualize these transactions, as well as the way Bradley styled himself in all of this. He's not making loads of money, but he seems to be getting by when he combines the compensation he receives with other sources of income from artistic work and odd jobs, etc. He hasn't given himself a title like a heritage consultant. There is someone else who does use that title. I don't discuss him here, but he exists. Bradley sees himself simply as a language activist, but he is fairly charismatic, as we'll see in a minute. Denver, on the other hand, has a slightly more entrepreneurial spirit. So in addition to his language advocacy work, which consists of lobbying the government, universities, and cultural institutions like the South African Museum in Cape Town, he produces T-shirts. And I've got one. I bought one. It says, Aibakwen Karuma, and that instantly he puts the Hinguni here, Amandla away to, so it's power to the people. He left out the English. So he produces the T-shirts with the Kwekwe language on them. That's just one example, the many others. He also produces things like bags together with his sister. So again, like Bradley, Denver is not making pots and pots of money, but he is getting by. Both Denver and Bradley have shown and continue to show tremendous resilience in the face of numerous challenges, including the crucial challenge of supporting oneself and making a living while continuing their language activism. Kegangan, Spy Donkey, thank you. And I think I'll end off with just playing 1 minute of Bradley doing his thing. And this, just to tell you what it's, give you the context. He was asked to speak at an event organized by PANSALB, which stands for the Pan South African Language Board, which is a statutory body in South Africa tasked with linguistic issues. And they had this event a few years ago, and Bradley was invited to speak. And I'll just play you the first minute or so. Okay, thanks everyone.
While we're still getting set up here, what I'm going to start with are the questions from the UN, which it's striking that they were, of course, composed without the benefit of the person composing them having heard the papers, only the abstracts. So they don't totally match. I'm not going to do all of these questions, but I want to try to pick something that fits the presentation. So let me start with Dan Kaufman. And because one of the questions here does talk about indigenous diasporic peoples. We know now what that means. It sounds a little bit like a contradiction in terms, but it fits the New York City case as Dan has presented it. So the UN representative who posed this question wanted to know about what are favorable conditions for knowledge sharing and dissemination of good practices among indigenous diasporic peoples. And so he's asking, from your experience, what techniques are most effective at creating such favorable conditions?
I don't think it's a matter of techniques. It's just maybe a matter of space and opportunities. So there's no such thing as a language hub in most cities where speakers of indigenous or endangered languages can communicate with each other, right? Every group thinks that they're kind of on their own, and in many cases I discovered that many groups think that this is something that's kind of only happening to them, right? They don't, at least maybe 10 years ago, they didn't really see it as a global phenomenon. So there have been some dramatic cases, when we had events. I remember we had different presenters, a kind of roughly similar type of event, and there was a Garifuna presenter, a friend of mine, and then an Irish presenter, and they were both talking about their experiences. And the Garifuna are kind of they're both African, black, indigenous people of Central America. And then when the Irish person came and talked about the history of the Irish language and the kind of things that they had to endure in Ireland, this Garifuna language activist was very moved that he didn't think that this was something that happened to white people or could happen to a white person. And that was a kind of a striking moment, that he realized that this actually goes beyond black and white and beyond his part of the world. So what's needed for that is just bringing people together more than anything. And I think both in diaspora contexts and non-diaspora contexts, a lot of groups have a lot to learn from each other, obviously, and so there has to be more kind of cross-community organizations, which don't really exist.
You spoke in your presentation about, for the peoples coming from Mexico, that there were Mexican national level festivals and so forth. Would you want to draw a distinction between the kinds of possibilities of communication about experiences and good practices, whatever exactly those would be, but anyway, among indigenous diasporic peoples who come from the same region or come from the same country, as opposed to your Garifuna and Irish person? That would be a different sort of setting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, now there are these national, for instance, in the Mexican community, there's national celebrations that have been happening forever, like Cinco de Mayo and Mexican Independence Day. But as of recently, there have also been organizations, and we've been a little active in helping with that, organizations that have created new festivals. One is called New York Tlan, and it's really a festival of indigenous Mexican culture. And part of the goal is actually to reunite families, so they get artist visas from the Mexican consulate to bring dancers and musicians to reunite with their families in New York, who they haven't seen in many, many years. So now that is a new thing. Organizations are creating kind of more authentic and festivals that are really catering particularly to an indigenous population.
Justin, is this a topic that can be meaningful to the case or the situation that you've looked at, given that perhaps in a sense, even though Kwe are indigenous to the Cape area, Cape Town is such a, I mean, it's not the kinds of circumstances that indigenous life was about? Or is it too different from, does it not fit the question well enough?
There are similarities. Just Cape Town is very colonial, it's very exclusive and exclusionary, and I think that's part of the many reasons this part of the story why this restoration movement has sprung up. People don't feel part of the city. They feel marginalized, left behind. There's no place for them. And I mean, just to touch on the kind of movement, and they, you know, they're torn between seeing Cape Town, well, there was no Cape Town, but seeing that area as their kind of ancestral home, and then looking to a place like Namibia, or the parts of the Northern Cape where Kwekwe language is still spoken. And so a lot of, Bradley, for instance, spent 6 months in Namibia. He went there, and you know, it was this kind of like rite of passage, and he spoke to elders there, and they yes, we were expecting you, and we knew there was a prophecy that one of our children from that area would come back and would want to know about the language. And so, you know, there's all these like mythologies and stories that get reproduced. I don't know if that answers. It's a rambling answer.
Well, let me try another one.
Okay.
That's supposed to be directed at you.
Yeah.
Because the questions, both of the questions here that were for you, are focused on public-private partnerships. And I wondered, the first one wants to know if you can give some examples of public-private partnerships that have successfully worked to support, empower, and promote indigenous peoples.
I can't, but I can give an example of two very controversial attempts. One of them is the kind of thing I showed you earlier, that stopover, the Khoi village, which is located along the Garden Route, which is a very famous tourist. It links Cape Town and the Eastern Cape, and it's very beautiful. And you know, it gets a lot of traffic. And so they built this weird thing. But even more controversial is another location called Kwatu, which is closer to Cape Town. It's on the west coast, just north, the west coast of South Africa, so just north of Cape Town. Now, these places are controversial for two reasons, I think. Firstly, they inevitably have a kind of theme park quality, which people, certainly the activists, resent. But secondly, and more seriously, I think, more significantly, these projects have largely ignored or bypassed the activists themselves. At least the grassroots activists, the ones that I have spent time with. So Kwatu is very controversial, and it is a sort of mixed-use facility. There's a conference venue. I haven't actually been there myself, but you can, when you visit there are Khoi and San people who teach you things about the culture. You get taught how to hunt, etc. I did interview an activist her name is Tanya, and she told me that the whole Kwatu concept was actually her idea. The whole idea was it was she and her organization produced a proposal. They even put together a business plan. It was very elaborate. They went to great lengths. It took them a long, long time, and I'm not sure where I forget where it was sent, if it was government or if they were lobbying private funders. But in the end, the whole thing was essentially hijacked by a gentleman who happens to be from Switzerland. He obviously had the financing to see the project through to the end, and he ended up getting the land. So he was given the land. So if you go to Kwatu, you will be supporting this Swiss individual whose name I don't know. And there is, what I can tell you is there's a tremendous amount of anger and bitterness among many activists. So this was basically a huge missed opportunity, I think, where a public-private partnership could have been involving the activists. Commercialized, yes, you have to make money somehow. But what they ended up with was really a disgrace.
Dan, do you have any comment on public-private partnerships and whether there are examples of some that are successful in supporting or empowering Indigenous peoples in your case?
Private in the narrow sense of kind of entrepreneurial type.
Well, that's part of a question, really,
Yeah.
is what's public and what's private, and what's at issue here?
Yeah. I don't have any great examples, but it's similar to Justin's talk. I remember all kinds of language activists that I've come into contact with, kind of struggling to make ends meet, and people with skills and very talented individuals, but with no market really for their skills, right? So I've often tried to brainstorm and think of things, but I can't say that I can point to any fantastic private-public models. Colleen, any ideas?
Yeah, I'd like to open the discussion now to everyone who would like to comment or raise a question for our panelists. Yes, Sally.
I have a question for Justin Brown. I'm sorry. Question for Justin Brown. I know that in some circles, maybe many circles, the whole notion of indigeneity is fraught, disputed, but I was still surprised at your saying that there was controversy about whether the Khoisan peoples, the Kwekwe and their colleagues in South Africa are the only indigenous people or not, because what I had read, quite possibly false, and you will tell me if so, was that about the time the Dutch settled in Cape Town, the Bantu herders moved in from the north, so that neither is indigenous. The Bantu herders came from the north.
The north?
Well, yeah,
Northeast.
farther north in Africa.
Oh, do you mean north of the South African border?
Yes.
Yeah, that predated Dutch settlement by many centuries, I think.
So far enough back that the Bantu speakers,
Would see themselves
Bantu
as
nations are considered indigenous in South
absolutely.
Africa.
Yeah.
Okay.
The point I was trying to make that maybe didn't come across clearly was the controversy centers around people setting themselves apart from the majority. So, and you must remember we came from a political struggle. So these debates weren't happening in the 1980s because we were all black. And what did it mean to be black in the 1980s? Well, it was political. It was we were the people who lacked political rights. So after 1994, things started getting a little bit more complex, and and that's really where you had this sort of emergence of the notion of the First Nation. Actually, we were here first, before you, you know, Nguni people who came from Congo or wherever it was, or you know, the Central Africa, or the Tswana or the Sotho. So, and again, what makes people uneasy is that this is a kind of essentializing, and you know, it's a very thing that, which the anti-apartheid struggle was against. I mean, it was, you know, it really, the ethos of the struggle was, we're all South African, and so to do this kind of division, it really makes a lot of people uneasy. I don't know if that answers.
Well, if I could just jump in on that too, because I've had some occasions to go to the UN, and the African scenario is very different from others where you have a case of European expansion and colonialism, and where it seems to be more clear where, quote, indigenous peoples were in that order. But in the African context in the UN, it tends to be a term of referring to peoples who self-define themselves as having a distinctive way of life that they seek to pursue and seek to preserve. People who are externally identified as being very distinctive from an external point of view, who are othered, who are not typically accorded respect, discriminated against. They're typically associated with some sort of territory or homeland that they may or may no longer occupy, and they tend to be politically disenfranchised. So those are the four common characteristics that bundle together to constitute a definition of indigeneity in Africa, which tend to be then focused on certain livelihoods. Pastoralists in East Africa, the Tuareg and the Bedouin in the north, Pygmies, which is an awful term, but we lack another one to refer to the many peoples who live in the forest regions of Central Africa, and then the Khoisan in the south.
Well, I mean, a good example of what you say is what's happening in Botswana with the Basarwa, or the San of who lived in the Kalahari Desert. So, as I understand it, the designation indigenous is used by academics in Botswana and by policymakers and within the country and externally, based on what you've just described. So, marginalization, oppression. So it's not to say that the Tswana, who are the majority, are not indigenous, but you know, they use the term indigenous to describe this kind of oppressed or persecuted category. Yeah.
So I guess this question is also for you, Justin. The group of people that you work with in your study, are they language revitalization activists or culture revitalization activists, or is there a difference between the two? And maybe it connects to things that Colleen talked about, which is like you meet the community at the place where they are at. And in the Cape Town region, there's very little, if any, Khoisan language left. So it's more at the moment culturally oriented rather than linguistically oriented, or?
Yeah, I think you're right. It is complicated. The two people I chose to focus on are very linguistic, in the sense that they push the language, they want to speak the language, they want others to speak the language, they want increased awareness, they want the language to be developed, they want it in the curriculum, they want resources, textbooks, all kinds of things. Not everyone, I would say that they're in the minority. Like most people, most of the activists are, of the cultural activists, who, I'm not saying they disregard the language, but it's kind of used. They're happy to know one or two words, it's fine. And it's symbolic. It indexes their identity, their indigenous identity, but they're, you know, I'm astounded. Like whenever I go to these events, these ceremonies, meetings, you only hear Afrikaans. Afrikaans, a little bit of English, when they hear someone like me, oh, you're from UCT, they switch to English. But I mean, everything is conducted in Afrikaans, and then the Kwekwe language is sort of greetings, salutations, a prayer, kind of these little kind of symbolic things, singing, etc. So people like Denver and Bradley who went to, as I said, spent 6 months in Namibia before he was deported. And he's determined to learn and to speak and to communicate, and so. But he's the exception, I think. Yeah.
I want to. In our last session, one of the questions that we had from the UN was regarding technology, and one of the things I noticed in the video that you played, Justin, is something that I see all over the place for language conferences, which is you had somebody, I don't know if they were streaming or they were just recording it, but I mean, I've been at so many language workshops and conferences where people they'd sit there with their iPads and video the whole thing. And I wonder if you could maybe share a little bit, because I also with Dan, with all the videos and all the ways in which going through the comments on the YouTube videos, there's a different way in which technology is playing this role. And I wonder if both of you could maybe speak to that.
Thank you. That's a great question. I mean, I literally could write the whole thesis just on the social media stuff. So WhatsApp groups, Facebook, Twitter, other kind of websites, and interactive things. But I mean, it's constant. I mean, I am bombarded every day with things, pictures, messages, events, advertising things. So it's really crazy. I mean, it's a lot. And so what you say is absolutely, everyone is recording with their phones. Everyone is passing things around. And then, it raises all kinds of ethical questions, because, I'm like a part of a WhatsApp group, and people know me. They don't necessarily know I'm, transcribing what they write. And so it can be very difficult. And so you have to be very careful, and I have tried to be very careful about only recording things of people I know, and I can actually talk to and ask them, is it okay if I kind of use this in my thesis or whatever? So but it's a lot. It is a lot of stuff.
Dan, do you have a comment on this?
Yeah, I'm very conflicted about technology. I mean, I myself use it a lot. I'm involved with making videos and software projects and stuff like that. At the same time, I really hate it. And I think that it's really kind of destroying a lot of lives. And I think that a lot of what we see is because everybody is kind of retreating into their own electronic bubbles. And, it's great for language research, it's great for language documentation. I don't think it's great for language revitalization at all. I mean, beyond those things. I think that it takes people away from human contact, and the whole point of language revitalization is to bring people together, and to revitalize more than just the words. You're revitalizing activities and ways of thinking, and that's very hard. It's not even a goal of most apps, right? Apps are just, there was kind of nice work by, what's her name? A linguist anthropologist who worked with the Western Apache. And there was a big conflict between, whether to use technology or not, and they introduced things like computers and apps and things like that. And it turned out to doom the project because many of the tribal members were against it. And they had some very interesting things to say about the way that this electronic pedagogy takes place. So like the kids are not learning the word naki, two. They're learning two is naki, or naki means two. because the electronic pedagogy is all about one-to-one translations and all of these things that are just, it's memorizing words. So I think that's kind of antithetical to the deeper point of language revitalization. So in that sense, I'm quite negative on it. When people ask me about apps and stuff, I say, try and develop an app that can bring people together. Otherwise, you're just training yourself to talk to your phone. On the other hand, I'm very pro technology when it comes to recording language, so it's, but in the cases that I spoke about, I mean, especially in some of the, basically all of the communities I spoke about today, you can really see that children are just, it's having a very, very bad effect on children. I mean, they're constantly in front of their phones, the parents are not able to supervise them. It has effects on their language, effects on their attention, effects on many things.
Yeah, people talk about the attention economy nowadays, and we were talking about economy and language in this panel, and that might be another aspect of it. We really should end the panel, I think. I'm not seeing a lot of hands up, and it's late in the day and we have closing remarks to get to. So let me thank our panelists for wonderful papers.